Picture this: January 1475. A frozen valley somewhere in Eastern Europe. Thick fog rolls across the ground like a living thing, and in the silence, 80,000 Ottoman soldiers are marching straight into what they think is an easy victory. They have no idea they're walking into a trap. Hidden in the ridges above them, 20,000 men wait in absolute silence. No fires, no movement, just the sound of their own breathing in the freezing air. Their leader, a man history would call the Great, has spent weeks turning this valley into a killing ground. What happens next will shock an empire, save a continent, and prove that sometimes the smaller army wins, not because of luck, but because of brilliant, ruthless preparation. This is the story of the Battle of Vaslui, and it's one of the most overlooked military masterpieces in European history. If you're enjoying this story already, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe. We dig into forgotten battles, incredible strategies, and the moments that changed history but somehow got left out of the textbooks. And if you think this battle deserves more recognition, share it with someone who loves history. All right, let's get into it. Let's be honest. When most people think about the Ottoman Empire in the 1400s, they think about one thing: conquest. And they're not wrong. By 1475, the Ottomans weren't just another regional power squabbling over territory. They were the superpower of their time. Think about it like this. If you were living in Europe during this period, the Ottoman Empire was the existential threat, the thing that kept kings awake at night. The reason diplomats spoke in whispers and why border towns built their walls thicker every year. Just 22 years earlier, in 1453, the Ottomans had done something most people thought was impossible. They'd captured Constantinople, the city that had stood for over 1,000 years as the jewel of the Byzantine Empire. The city with walls so massive, so well defended, that it had turned back countless armies throughout history. The Ottomans brought it down in less than 2 months. That wasn't just a military victory. It was a psychological earthquake. Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, became the Ottoman capital, and suddenly, the message to Europe was crystal clear: nothing is safe. Nothing is untouchable. And the Ottomans didn't stop there. They pushed deeper into the Balkans year after year. Serbia, conquered. Bosnia, absorbed. Parts of Greece, Bulgaria, Albania, all falling under Ottoman control like dominoes. Their armies were disciplined, well-supplied, and led by commanders who'd spent their entire lives learning the art of war. But here's what made them truly terrifying. They weren't just good at fighting. They were good at everything that made empires work: administration, logistics, engineering. They could move massive armies across difficult terrain, keep them fed for months, and coordinate sieges that involved thousands of men and dozens of massive cannons. In short, they had it figured out. Now, here's where geography gets interesting. North of the Ottoman territories, squeezed between the empire and the rest of Europe, sat a small principality called Moldavia. And when I say small, I mean small. We're talking about a landlocked territory of forests, hills, and river valleys. No massive fortresses, no legendary armies, no wealthy merchant cities pumping gold into the treasury. What Moldavia did have was location. And in geopolitics, location is everything. Moldavia sat right at the crossroads between 3 major powers: the Ottoman Empire to the south, the Kingdom of Hungary to the west, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to the north. Every trade route heading into Central Europe from the south passed through Moldavian territory. Every military campaign aiming at Hungary or Poland would have to deal with Moldavia first. Control Moldavia, and you control the gateway into the heart of Europe. The Ottomans understood this perfectly. So did everyone else. For years, Moldavia had survived by playing a delicate balancing act. Pay tribute to the Ottomans to keep them happy. Make promises to Hungary and Poland to keep them friendly. Don't pick sides. Don't provoke anyone. Stay small, stay quiet, and maybe, just maybe, you get to keep existing. But that kind of survival strategy has an expiration date. By the early 1470s, the Ottoman Empire wasn't interested in cooperative neighbors anymore. They wanted vassals. They wanted obedience. And eventually, they wanted complete control. The demands on Moldavia grew heavier. More money, more soldiers for Ottoman campaigns, more control over key fortresses and ports. And here's the thing about empires. Once they start tightening their grip, they rarely loosen it. Appeasement doesn't buy you safety, it just buys you time. And even that time gets shorter with every concession you make. Other small states around Moldavia had already learned this the hard way. They tried to cooperate, tried to stay friendly, tried to avoid conflict. And one by one, they'd been absorbed. Their rulers replaced. Their armies dissolved. Their identities erased. Moldavia was staring down the same path. Now, imagine you're a Moldavian farmer in 1474. You've heard the stories. You've seen refugees from other regions passing through, carrying whatever they could salvage from their homes. You've heard about the Ottoman armies, tens of thousands of soldiers, moving like a storm, unstoppable and relentless. And you know they're coming closer. The question wasn't if the Ottomans would invade. The question was when, and whether Moldavia would even bother resisting, or just quietly submit and hope for mercy. But Moldavia had something most people didn't expect. It had Stephen III. Later, history would call him Stephen the Great. But in 1474, he was just a ruler trying to keep his small country alive in a world dominated by giants. He'd inherited a principality with no natural defenses, no powerful allies, and no realistic chance of winning a straight fight against the Ottoman war machine. What he did have was a brain that worked differently than most rulers of his time. Stephen wasn't interested in glorious charges or heroic last stands. He wasn't trying to out-army the Ottomans or outspin them. He knew that was a losing game. Instead, he started thinking about asymmetry, about leverage, about how to turn Moldavia's weaknesses into advantages, and about how to make the Ottomans' strengths work against them. Because here's a truth about massive armies: they need supplies. They need clear routes. They need reliable intelligence. They need to be able to see where they're going and coordinate thousands of men across complex terrain. Take those things away, and suddenly, size doesn't matter as much as you'd think. Stephen started preparing, not loudly, not obviously, but methodically. He studied Ottoman tactics. He mapped every valley, every river crossing, every patch of forest in Moldavian territory. He quietly moved supplies. He trained his men differently than traditional armies. And he waited, because he knew something the Ottomans didn't. The invasion was coming, yes, but it was coming on his terms, on his land, in his season. By late 1474, the pieces were moving into place. Ottoman commanders were assembling an army large enough to crush Moldavia in a single campaign. Tens of thousands of soldiers, ready to march north and finish this problem once and for all. What they didn't realize was that Stephen had already chosen the battlefield, a valley near a small town called Vaslui, a place where, in just a few weeks, history was about to bend in a direction no one, least of all the Ottoman Empire, could have predicted. Stephen III didn't start out as a hero. He started out as a survivor. Born in 1433, Stephen inherited the throne of Moldavia in 1457, and if you're doing the math, that means he became ruler at around 24 years old. Young, yes, but not inexperienced. He'd already seen enough court politics, betrayals, and violence to understand how the world actually worked. And the world worked like this: big fish eat small fish. Always. When Stephen took power, Moldavia was barely holding together. The previous decades had been chaotic: rival claimants fighting for the throne, neighboring powers meddling in internal affairs, and the constant pressure of Ottoman expansion creeping closer every year. Stephen's first priority wasn't glory. It was stability. He spent his early years consolidating power, eliminating rivals, and building a functioning government. He reorganized the treasury. He established better relationships with the nobility, not easy when half of them would happily sell you out for the right price. He fortified key locations and trained a standing army that was small but loyal. In other words, he did all the boring, unglamorous work that doesn't make it into epic poems, but actually keeps countries from collapsing. And through it all, he watched the Ottomans. Here's what Stephen understood better than most rulers of his time. The Ottoman Empire wasn't going to stop. This wasn't a temporary expansion that would eventually plateau. This was a machine designed to grow, conquer, and absorb. And every year, it got closer. At first, Stephen played the game everyone played. He paid tribute to the Ottomans, a yearly sum that essentially said, "Please don't invade us, we're cooperating." He sent diplomatic gifts. He made the right noises about friendship and mutual respect. But he also knew this was a temporary solution. Because here's the problem with paying tribute to an empire: it never stays the same. The first year, they asked for a reasonable amount. The second year, they ask for a little more. The third year, they want soldiers for their campaigns. The fourth year, they want control over your ports. The fifth year, they're basically running your country, and you're just a figurehead waiting to be replaced. Stephen watched this pattern play out in other territories around him. He saw rulers who thought cooperation would save them. It didn't. They just lost their countries slowly instead of quickly. So Stephen made a decision that most people in his position wouldn't have made. He decided to draw a line. Not immediately, not dramatically, but carefully, deliberately, and with full knowledge of what it would cost. The breaking point came over control of two key fortresses, Chilia and Citadia Alba. These weren't just military positions, they were economic lifelines. They controlled access to the Black Sea, which meant they controlled trade routes that brought wealth into Moldavia. The Ottomans wanted them. And by wanted, I mean they started making demands that weren't really requests. Stephen refused. Now, understand what this meant. Refusing the Ottoman Empire in the 1470s was essentially signing your own death warrant. You didn't say no to them. You couldn't. They were too powerful, too relentless, and too willing to make examples out of anyone who defied them. But Stephen said no anyway. Not because he was reckless, not because he had some suicidal sense of honor, but because he'd done the math, and he realized something crucial. If he gave up those fortresses, Moldavia was finished. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. The Ottomans would keep taking pieces until there was nothing left. At least if he fought, there was a chance, however slim, of survival. Of course, fighting the Ottoman Empire required more than just courage. It required allies. So Stephen reached out to every Christian power in the region. He sent envoys to Hungary, explaining that if Moldavia fell, Hungary would be next. He appealed to Poland, pointing out that Ottoman control of Moldavia would put their southern border in immediate danger. He even reached out to the Pope, framing the conflict as a defense of Christendom against Islamic expansion. And the responses he got back were polite. Hungary expressed sympathy. Poland sent encouraging words. The Pope called Stephen a champion. But actual help? Actual soldiers, supplies, money? Nothing. Zero. Because here's the ugly truth about geopolitics. Everyone loves a buffer state. As long as someone else is absorbing the enemy's attention, you're safe. Nobody wanted Moldavia to fall, but nobody wanted to risk their own armies defending it either. Stephen accepted this reality without bitterness. He'd expected it, honestly. Relying on allies who had their own problems was never a solid strategy. If Moldavia was going to survive, it would have to do it alone. So he focused on what he could control. He couldn't match the Ottomans in numbers, so he focused on mobility. He couldn't outspend them, so he focused on intelligence and terrain. He couldn't win a conventional battle, so he stopped trying to fight conventionally. Stephen studied Ottoman tactics obsessively. He talked to merchants who traveled through Ottoman territories. He debriefed prisoners and deserters. He learned how Ottoman armies moved, how they supplied themselves, what formations they preferred, and what mistakes they rarely made. And then he started thinking about how to force them into making those mistakes. He reorganized his army around speed and flexibility. Heavy cavalry was useful, sure, but light cavalry that could strike, retreat, and strike again was more valuable in Moldavian terrain. He trained archers to fight from horseback and from concealed positions. He drilled his men on rapid deployment and coordinated retreats. He also did something most rulers didn't. He involved the common people in defense planning. Moldavian peasants weren't just cannon fodder to Stephen. They were assets. They knew the land better than anyone. They knew which paths through the forest were passable in winter, which river crossings were safe, and where the ground turned soft under snow. Stephen integrated them into his strategy, giving them roles that played to their strengths. And slowly, carefully, he started preparing Moldavia itself as a weapon. By mid-1474, the relationship between Moldavia and the Ottoman Empire had deteriorated completely. Border skirmishes turned into open confrontations. Ottoman officials stopped sending diplomatic letters and started sending ultimatums. And then came the final provocation. Stephen launched a raid into Ottoman-controlled territory, not a full invasion, but a calculated strike designed to send a message: Moldavia will not submit quietly. The Ottoman response was predictable. Sultan Mehmed II, the same man who'd conquered Constantinople, ordered his commanders to assemble an overwhelming force and crush this upstart principality once and for all. The message was clear. Stephen had crossed a line, and now he would pay for it. But Stephen had already prepared for this moment. He'd spent years getting ready. And now, as Ottoman armies began gathering along the Danube, he put the final pieces of his plan into motion. He knew where the battle would happen. He knew when. And he knew that the Ottomans, for all their power and experience, were about to walk straight into a trap they'd never see coming. Because Stephen wasn't planning to fight the Ottoman Empire. He was planning to make the Ottoman Empire destroy itself. Winter came early to Moldavia in 1474. By December, snow had already blanketed the forests, and temperatures dropped low enough to freeze the rivers solid. For most armies, this meant the end of the campaign season. You didn't march tens of thousands of men through frozen terrain, across icy roads, with limited supplies and hostile weather. But Stephen wasn't planning a campaign. He was planning a defense. And winter wasn't his enemy. It was his advantage. The Ottoman army gathering along the Danube was massive. Scouts reported anywhere from 60,000 to 100,000 men. Historians still debate the exact number, but everyone agrees it was overwhelming. The force included elite janissaries, disciplined infantry, skilled archers, and cavalry units that had conquered half the Balkans. Against this, Stephen had roughly 20,000 men, maybe less. On paper, this wasn't a fight. It was a massacre waiting to happen. But Stephen had never planned to fight on paper. The first thing he did, and this is crucial, was evacuate the civilians. Villages near the southern border, the ones directly in the Ottoman invasion route, were quietly emptied. Families packed what they could carry and moved north to safer areas. Livestock was driven away. Food stores were relocated or hidden. This wasn't cruelty. It was strategy. Because here's what happens when an army invades. It needs to eat. A force of 60,000 men doesn't carry enough supplies to sustain itself for weeks. They rely on foraging, on seizing food from local populations, on finding shelter in villages along the way. Take that away, and suddenly the invasion becomes a logistical nightmare. Stephen didn't just evacuate people. He actively sabotaged the infrastructure. Wells were filled with dirt and rocks. Bridges were damaged or destroyed. Paths through the forests were blocked with fallen trees. Grain stores were burned. Anything that could help the Ottomans survive the winter march was eliminated. This is scorched earth tactics, and it's brutal. But Stephen wasn't trying to be merciful. He was trying to win. The Moldavian people understood this. They didn't resist the evacuations. They didn't complain about losing their homes temporarily. Because they trusted Stephen. They'd seen what happened to other principalities that tried to appease the Ottomans, and they knew resistance was the only option left. So they moved. Quietly, efficiently, and without panic. While the civilians relocated, Stephen focused on his army. 20,000 men sounds like a lot until you're facing an enemy 3 or 4 times that size. Stephen couldn't afford to lose men in pointless skirmishes or poorly planned engagements. Every soldier mattered. Every horse, every arrow, every sword. So he reorganized everything. Traditional medieval armies were built around heavy cavalry, knights in armor, charging in formation, smashing through enemy lines. It looked impressive. It worked well in open field battles. But it required resources Moldavia didn't have, and it wasn't suited to the kind of fight Stephen was planning. Instead, he built his army around light cavalry. These weren't knights in full plate armor. They were fast riders on quick horses, carrying bows, sabers, and light spears. They could cover ground rapidly, strike from unexpected angles, and disappear before the enemy could respond. Think of them as medieval hit-and-run specialists. Stephen drilled them relentlessly, not on glorious charges, but on coordination, timing, and discipline. They practiced firing arrows from horseback while moving at full speed. They practiced coordinated retreats, pulling back without breaking formation, luring enemies into traps. They practiced operating in small units that could act independently but still follow a larger strategy. This was asymmetric warfare before the term existed. Stephen also integrated peasant levies into his plans, but not as expendable fodder. These men weren't trained soldiers, and they didn't have expensive equipment. What they did have was intimate knowledge of the terrain. They knew every trail through the forests. They knew which hills provided the best vantage points. They knew where the rivers ran shallow and where they didn't. They knew how fog settled in the valleys and how sound carried across the ridges. Stephen gave them roles that leveraged this knowledge. They became scouts, guides, and ambush units. They weren't expected to stand in line and trade blows with janissaries. They were expected to appear, strike, and vanish. And they were damn good at it. Meanwhile, Stephen was obsessing over one specific location, the valley near Vaslui. This wasn't random. He'd studied the geography of Moldavia for years, and Vaslui had everything he needed. Narrow approaches that would force the Ottomans into long, vulnerable columns. Ridges on both sides perfect for hidden archers. Marshes and frozen rivers that would limit movement. And most importantly, winter fog. Fog is an interesting weapon. You can't control it, but you can predict it. Stephen knew that in January, thick fog rolled through the Vaslui Valley almost every morning. It would limit visibility to a few dozen meters. It would muffle sound. It would make coordination nearly impossible for a large, unfamiliar army. For the Moldavians, who knew the terrain by heart, the fog would be an advantage. Stephen ordered preparations to begin weeks in advance. Trenches were dug along the ridges, then covered with snow so they'd be invisible to anyone marching below. Archer positions were established behind natural cover, rocks, trees, ridges, where they could fire without being seen. Small cannons, mounted on sleds so they could be moved quickly, were positioned at key points. These weren't massive siege weapons. They were light, mobile, and perfect for firing into dense formations before disappearing into the forest. Stephen even prepared false retreat routes, paths that looked safe but led into dead ends or ambush zones. Everything was designed around one principle: make the Ottomans think they're winning, right up until the moment they realize they're dying. But there was one more element to the plan, and it was psychological. Stephen needed the Ottomans to be confident. Overconfident, even. He needed them to believe Moldavia was weak, disorganized, and ready to collapse. So he staged it. Moldavian cavalry started launching small raids on Ottoman supply lines. Quick, chaotic attacks that looked desperate. They'd hit a wagon train, cause some damage, then flee in apparent panic. They avoided any serious engagements. They gave the impression of an army that was scattered, afraid, and running out of options. Ottoman commanders saw exactly what Stephen wanted them to see: a country on the verge of collapse. They didn't see the trap closing around them. By early January 1475, everything was ready. The civilians were safe. The army was positioned. The valley was prepared. And Ottoman scouts were reporting that the Moldavian forces were retreating northward, apparently trying to avoid battle. The Ottoman commander, Hatem Suleiman Pasha, made his decision: pursue aggressively, catch the Moldavians before they could escape, and crush them in one decisive engagement. His army began marching into Moldavia, straight toward Vaslui. Stephen watched from the ridges, surrounded by his closest commanders. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just watched as tens of thousands of enemy soldiers moved deeper into the valley, following roads he'd left open, crossing rivers at points he'd carefully left accessible. One of his officers asked if they should attack now. Stephen shook his head. Not yet. The trap wasn't just about location. It was about timing. He needed the Ottomans fully committed, deep in the valley, confident they were winning. He needed them exactly where they couldn't escape. And then, when the fog rolled in and the winter morning turned the valley into a white, soundless maze, he would show them what happens when an empire underestimates a cornered nation. The wait was almost over. Let's talk about terrain for a moment. Most people think battles are won by whoever has more soldiers, better weapons, or superior training. And sure, those things matter. But there's another factor that's just as important, and it's often overlooked: where you fight. The right terrain can turn a disadvantage into an advantage. It can neutralize enemy strengths and amplify your own. It can make a smaller army fight like a larger one, and a larger army stumble like a smaller one. Stephen understood this instinctively. The valley near Vaslui wasn't chosen randomly. It was chosen because it was perfect. Perfect for ambush, perfect for confusion, and perfect for turning the Ottoman army's size into a liability instead of an asset. Let me paint you a picture of what this place actually looked like. The valley itself ran roughly north to south, with the town of Vaslui sitting near the northern end. It wasn't a wide, open space. It was relatively narrow, with forested ridges rising on both sides. Think of it like a funnel, wide at the southern entrance, gradually narrowing as you moved north. Running through the valley was the Barlad River and several smaller tributaries. In summer, these were manageable. You could ford them at multiple points without much trouble. But in January, they were frozen. Partially, unpredictably frozen. The kind of ice that looked solid but could crack under the weight of too many soldiers or horses. The ridges on either side weren't steep cliffs, but they were high enough to provide commanding views of the valley floor. Forested, rocky, and filled with natural cover, perfect for hiding troops. And then there was the fog. In winter, cold air from the surrounding hills would settle into the valley overnight, mixing with moisture from the river. By dawn, the entire area would be blanketed in thick, low-hanging fog. Visibility would drop to almost nothing. You couldn't see more than a few dozen meters in any direction. For an army that relied on maintaining formation, coordination, and visual command signals, that fog was a nightmare. For defenders who knew every rock, every tree, and every inch of ground, it was a gift. Stephen spent weeks studying this valley. He walked the ridges himself, noting sight lines and arrow ranges. He timed how long it took to move between positions. He observed when the fog rolled in and when it lifted. He tested the ice on the river, checking which areas were stable and which were dangerously thin. He turned geography into intelligence. And then he started shaping the battlefield. The first thing he did was establish concealed positions for his archers. Not obvious ones. No fortifications or earthworks that would give away their locations. Instead, he used natural features. Ridges with tree cover, rock formations that provided shelter, slight rises in the terrain that offered good firing angles without exposing the shooters. Each position was carefully chosen to create overlapping fields of fire. If the Ottomans entered the valley and advanced north, they'd be walking through a gauntlet. Arrows would come from multiple directions, and there'd be no obvious target to counterattack. Next came the artillery, and I use that term loosely because we're not talking about massive cannons. These were small, mobile guns mounted on wooden sleds, light enough to be moved quickly, but powerful enough to tear through infantry formations at close range. Stephen positioned them along the ridges, hidden behind tree lines. The key was mobility. Fire a few shots, create chaos, then move to a new position before the enemy could locate and target you. He also prepared false positions, places that looked like they might hold troops, designed to draw Ottoman attention away from the real threats. But the most interesting part of Stephen's preparation was psychological. He needed the Ottomans to enter the valley willingly, confidently, and without suspicion. That meant controlling what they saw and heard in the days leading up to the battle. So Stephen orchestrated a campaign of deception. Moldavian cavalry units started conducting what looked like panicked retreats. They'd engage briefly with Ottoman scouts, then flee northward in apparent disarray. They'd abandon supplies. They'd leave behind campfires that were still burning, suggesting hasty evacuations. Every signal said the same thing. Moldavia is collapsing. Their army is in retreat. Victory is inevitable. Ottoman commanders, seeing this, did exactly what Stephen hoped they'd do. They pursued aggressively. Why wouldn't they? Everything they saw confirmed their expectations. Moldavia was a small, weak principality facing an overwhelming force. Of course they were running. The only question was how quickly the Ottomans could catch them. Hatem Suleiman Pasha, leading the Ottoman army, pushed his forces forward. Speed was critical. If the Moldavians escaped too far north, the campaign would drag on, supplies would dwindle, and winter would make everything harder. Better to crush them now, decisively, and end this quickly. So the Ottoman army marched into Moldavia in early January 1475. Tens of thousands of men, moving in long columns because the roads and valleys didn't allow for wider formations. Janissaries, cavalry, infantry, supply wagons, an entire military machine on the move. And as they advanced, they saw exactly what they expected: abandoned villages, empty roads, and signs of a retreating enemy. They didn't see the Moldavian scouts shadowing their every move from the forests. They didn't see the hidden archer positions being quietly manned along the ridges. They didn't see the artillery being moved into place under cover of darkness. They saw what Stephen wanted them to see. By January 9th, the Ottoman army had reached the southern approach to the Vaslui Valley. Scouts reported that Moldavian forces had been sighted ahead, apparently trying to regroup near the town of Vaslui itself. Suleiman Pasha made his decision: advance through the valley, catch the Moldavians before they could fortify, and finish this. The Ottoman columns began entering the valley in the late afternoon. By nightfall, thousands of soldiers were camped along the valley floor, preparing for what they expected would be a final, decisive engagement the next morning. They set up camps. They lit fires. They ate, talked, and rested, confident that tomorrow would bring an easy victory. Above them, hidden in the darkness along the ridges, Stephen's men waited in absolute silence. No fires, no voices, just the sound of wind moving through the trees and the occasional creak of leather as someone shifted position. Stephen himself was there, watching the Ottoman campfires spread across the valley below like fallen stars. One of his commanders approached and asked quietly if the men should get some rest. Stephen nodded, but he told them to sleep in their armor, with weapons within arm's reach. Because dawn was coming, and with it, the fog. The valley was ready. The trap was set. And in a few hours, when the sun rose and the white mist rolled in, the Ottoman Empire was about to learn a lesson it would never forget. Size doesn't matter when you can't see what's killing you. January 10th, 1475. Just before dawn. If you've ever been in thick fog, you know how disorienting it is. Sound behaves strangely, sometimes muffled, sometimes amplified from unexpected directions. Distances become impossible to judge. Shapes blur, and anything more than a few meters away simply disappears. Now imagine you're a soldier in an army of 60,000 men, camped in an unfamiliar valley, and you wake up to find that the world has vanished into a wall of white mist. That's what happened to the Ottoman army. The fog rolled in around 4 a.m., thick and low-hanging, blanketing the entire valley. Within an hour, visibility had dropped to less than 50 meters. Campfires became dim orange glows. Soldiers standing 30 feet apart couldn't see each other clearly. For the Moldavians hidden in the ridges above, it was perfect. Stephen had been awake all night. He'd positioned himself on a ridge overlooking the valley's northern section, surrounded by his most trusted commanders. From there, he could hear the Ottoman camp stirring below, voices, horses, the clatter of equipment as men prepared to move. But they couldn't see him. They couldn't see his archers. They couldn't see the thousands of Moldavian soldiers positioned along both sides of the valley, waiting in absolute silence. Around 5:30 a.m., the Ottoman army began to march. You have to understand, Ottoman commanders were experienced professionals. They knew how to move large forces through difficult terrain. They maintained discipline, kept formations tight, and sent scouts ahead to check for threats. But the fog changed everything. Scouts couldn't see far enough to be useful. Formations became harder to maintain because soldiers couldn't see the man 5 positions down the line. Officers shouted orders, but in the mist, it was hard to tell where the voices were coming from. The Ottomans were advancing blind, and Stephen let them. He watched from the ridge as the Ottoman columns moved deeper into the valley. He could hear them, the rhythmic sound of thousands of boots, the jingle of equipment, the occasional shouted command. But they couldn't see what was waiting for them. Not yet. Stephen raised his hand, signaling his commanders to hold. The men around him were tense, gripping weapons, waiting for the order. But Stephen's hand stayed raised. Wait. Let them get deeper. Let them commit fully. Let them believe they're unopposed. The Ottoman vanguard reached the narrowest part of the valley, the kill zone Stephen had chosen weeks ago. Behind them, more columns were still filing in from the south. The entire army was strung out in a long, vulnerable line. Now, Stephen dropped his hand. The first sound the Ottomans heard wasn't a battle cry. It was horns. Moldavian war horns, echoing from different directions across the valley. In the fog, the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. Ahead, behind, left, right. The horns weren't loud enough to be clearly located, but loud enough to create a sense of being surrounded. Psychological warfare. The Ottomans slowed. Officers shouted orders, trying to form defensive positions. But before they could organize, the arrows began. Hundreds of them at first, then thousands. Silent, invisible death falling from the ridges. Moldavian archers, firing from concealed positions into the densely packed Ottoman columns below. And here's the cruel genius of it. The Ottomans couldn't see where the arrows were coming from. They couldn't return fire effectively. They couldn't charge the enemy positions because they didn't know where the enemy was. All they could do was raise shields, try to form tighter formations, and pray. But Stephen wasn't done. The cannons fired. Small, mobile guns positioned along the ridges opened up with a thunderous roar that echoed through the valley. The sound was deafening, amplified by the fog. The shots tore into Ottoman formations, creating instant chaos. And then came the cavalry. Moldavian light cavalry units burst out of the fog from multiple directions, sudden, fast, devastating. They weren't charging in massed formations like traditional heavy cavalry. They were hitting specific points, firing arrows, slashing with sabers, then disappearing back into the mist before the Ottomans could respond. Hit and run. Strike and vanish. Some units attacked from the left flank, others from the right. Some came from behind, hitting supply wagons and creating panic in the rear. The Ottomans spun in circles, trying to defend from every direction at once. Officers screamed orders. Soldiers tried to form defensive squares. But in the fog, communication broke down. Units moved forward when they should have held position. Others retreated into their own allies. The discipline that made Ottoman armies so effective just evaporated. Because you can't maintain discipline when you can't see. Suleiman Pasha, somewhere near the center of the Ottoman force, tried desperately to restore order. He sent runners with commands, but in the chaos and fog, half of them never reached their destinations. He tried to coordinate a counterattack, but against what? The enemy was invisible. And then Stephen delivered the final blow. A deep, rolling blast from Moldavian trumpets echoed across the valley. This wasn't harassment anymore. This was the main assault. From the ridges, Moldavian infantry charged down in a coordinated wave. Not recklessly. These weren't desperate men throwing themselves forward. They moved in organized units, hitting precise points in the Ottoman lines where the arrows and cavalry had already created gaps. The Ottomans, already disoriented and battered, suddenly found themselves fighting a close-quarters battle against an enemy who knew exactly where they were. The valley erupted into brutal, chaotic combat. Steel clashing, men shouting, horses screaming. The fog turned the battlefield into dozens of isolated fights, small units hacking at each other, unable to see the larger picture. And in that chaos, the Moldavians had every advantage. They knew the terrain. They knew which direction was safe to retreat. They could coordinate with nearby units because they'd drilled these movements for weeks. The Ottomans had none of that. Some Ottoman units tried to fall back across the frozen river. Bad idea. Moldavian archers targeted the ice. Arrows struck again and again, weakening the already questionable surface. Men and horses began breaking through, plunging into freezing water. The screams carried across the valley. Other units tried to retreat south, back the way they'd come, only to find Moldavian cavalry had circled around and blocked the route. They were trapped. Stephen rode into the battlefield only when he was certain the enemy was fully broken. His appearance, visible even through the fog by the banners his men carried, sparked a final surge of Moldavian momentum. Soldiers who'd been fighting hard suddenly fought harder. They pressed forward, driving Ottoman units into tighter, more desperate positions. By midday, the fog finally started to lift, and what it revealed was carnage. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers lay scattered across the frozen ground. The river was littered with bodies and broken ice. Equipment, weapons, and banners were strewn everywhere. The once mighty columns that had marched confidently into the valley were gone, replaced by scattered groups of survivors stumbling through the snow, trying to escape. The Battle of Vaslui was over, and the Ottoman Empire had just suffered one of the worst defeats in its history. There's a specific kind of silence that follows a battle. It's not peaceful. It's not calm. It's the absence of something that should be there. The thousands of voices, the clash of weapons, the thunder of hooves. When that stops, what's left is eerie. Just wind and breathing and the occasional cry of someone still alive in the wreckage. That's what the Vaslui Valley sounded like by early afternoon on January 10th. The fog had lifted completely now, and for the first time, both sides could see the full scope of what had happened. For the Moldavians standing on the ridges, the view was almost surreal. The valley floor was covered in fallen soldiers, broken weapons, abandoned equipment, and the remnants of what had been, just hours ago, one of the most powerful military forces in the world. For the surviving Ottomans, the view was a nightmare made real. Let's be clear about something. The Ottoman army didn't just lose this battle. It was destroyed. This wasn't a tactical retreat or a narrow defeat. It was a catastrophic collapse. Historians estimate that somewhere between 40,000 and 45,000 Ottoman soldiers died that day. Some fell to arrows, others to cavalry charges. Hundreds drowned when the ice broke beneath them. Many more died trying to flee through unfamiliar forest terrain, pursued by Moldavian scouts who knew every path. Out of an army that had entered Moldavia with 60,000 to 80,000 men, maybe 15,000 escaped. And even those survivors were scattered, demoralized, and in no condition to fight. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was a psychological one. Because empires aren't supposed to lose like this. The Ottoman military machine, the same force that had conquered Constantinople, subjugated the Balkans, and terrified all of Europe, had just been humiliated by a tiny principality most people couldn't find on a map. Stephen didn't celebrate immediately. He stood on the ridge, watching his officers move through the battlefield, and his expression was unreadable. One of his commanders approached, grinning, and said something about a historic victory. Stephen nodded, but his response was measured. The victory means nothing if we don't survive what comes next. Because that's the thing about defeating an empire, they don't just accept it and move on. They come back, angrier, more determined, and often more dangerous. But for now, Stephen had work to do. The first priority was securing the battlefield. Moldavian soldiers moved through the valley, collecting weapons, armor, and supplies from the fallen. This wasn't disrespectful, it was practical. Moldavia didn't have the resources to waste anything, and Ottoman equipment was high quality. Prisoners were taken, though not many. Most of the survivors had fled, and Stephen ordered his men not to pursue too aggressively. He needed his army intact, not scattered across the countryside chasing stragglers. The wounded, both Moldavian and Ottoman, were gathered and given basic care. Again, this was practical. Prisoners could be ransomed. Information could be extracted. And showing some mercy sent a message that Moldavia wasn't just a band of ruthless killers, but a legitimate state that followed the rules of war. Stephen also sent fast riders to spread the news. Messengers galloped north to Moldavian towns and villages with a simple message: "We won. You're safe." The reaction across Moldavia was explosive. People who'd spent weeks in fear, who'd evacuated their homes, who'd believed they might never return. Suddenly they had hope. Church bells rang. Families embraced. Farmers who'd hidden in the forests emerged, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. For the first time in months, Moldavians allowed themselves to believe they might actually survive. But Stephen's mind was already on the next move. He called a meeting with his senior commanders that evening. They gathered in a commandeered building near Vaslui, exhausted but exhilarated. Some were injured. All were filthy. But they'd won, and the adrenaline of victory was still coursing through them. Stephen let them talk for a few minutes, let them savor the moment. Then he brought them back to reality. "This victory buys us time," he said. "Nothing more. The Ottomans will rebuild. They'll send another army, probably larger than this one, and they'll be angrier." One of his commanders argued that the defeat had been so devastating, the Ottomans might not try again. After all, who would want to march into Moldavia after what just happened? Stephen shook his head. They'll come back because they have to. If they don't, every other vassal state, every tributary, every conquered territory will start to wonder, if Moldavia can defeat the empire, why can't we? He was right. For the Ottoman Empire, Vaslui wasn't just a military loss. It was a credibility crisis. Their entire system of control depended on the perception of invincibility. Once that perception cracks, it's hard to repair. Stephen knew this. And he knew that meant Moldavia had to move quickly. While his army rested and recovered, Stephen sent envoys racing to every Christian power in Europe. The message they carried was carefully crafted. Moldavia just did what everyone said was impossible. We held the line. We stopped the Ottoman advance. But we can't do it alone forever. This time, the responses were different. Before the battle, Stephen's pleas for help had been met with polite sympathy and empty promises. Now European courts were paying attention. In Hungary, King Matthias Corvinus suddenly became very interested in forming an alliance with Moldavia. In Poland, officials who'd ignored Stephen's previous messages were now sending congratulations and discussing military cooperation. The Pope, in Rome, declared Stephen a champion of Christ and called for support to be sent to Moldavia. Church leaders across Europe praised the victory as a divine miracle, proof that God was on the side of Christendom. Even Venice, usually more interested in trade than religious wars, started reassessing its relationship with the Ottomans. The Battle of Vaslui had changed the political landscape, but Stephen remained cautious. He'd seen how quickly promises could evaporate when it was actually time to commit troops and resources. So he didn't wait for help. Instead, he focused on what he could control. He rebuilt his army. He reinforced fortifications. He established supply lines and ensured his people had enough food to survive the rest of winter. He sent scouts to monitor Ottoman movements along the border. And he prepared for the possibility that the Ottomans would return, because they would, just not as soon as anyone expected. The defeat at Vaslui was so catastrophic that it took the Ottoman Empire months to recover. Suleiman Pasha, the commander who'd led the army into the trap, was recalled to Istanbul. He was executed, not for losing, but for losing badly. Sultan Mehmed II was furious. The man who'd conquered Constantinople had just been embarrassed by a principality he could have bought with a year's worth of tax revenue. But even Mehmed understood that rushing back into Moldavia would be a mistake. The winter was still harsh. His army needed to be rebuilt. And more importantly, he needed a better plan than march in and overwhelm them with numbers. That strategy had just cost him 40,000 men. For the next several months, an uneasy quiet settled over the region. Moldavia fortified. The Ottomans rebuilt. And Europe watched, wondering if this victory was the beginning of a genuine resistance movement, or just a temporary setback for an empire that always, eventually, got what it wanted. Stephen didn't waste time wondering. He kept working, kept preparing, kept assuming the worst. Because in his experience, assuming the worst was how you survived when you were surrounded by empires. And Moldavia, against all odds, was still surviving. News traveled slowly in the 15th century, but some news traveled faster than others. And the news that a tiny principality had just destroyed an Ottoman army? That traveled like wildfire. Within days, messengers were carrying word of the battle across Europe. Within weeks, the story had reached every major court, every important city, and every church from Lisbon to Moscow. And everywhere it went, the reaction was the same. Disbelief, followed by shock, followed by wild celebration. Because here's what you have to understand. By 1475, the Ottoman Empire had become Europe's collective nightmare. For decades, Christian kingdoms had watched helplessly as the Ottomans conquered territory after territory, pushing deeper into Europe with seemingly unstoppable momentum. Constantinople had fallen. Serbia, Bosnia, parts of Hungary, all under Ottoman control. Every few years brought news of another defeat, another city taken, another Christian ruler forced to submit. The prevailing mood across Europe wasn't just fear. It was resignation, a grim acceptance that maybe, eventually, the Ottomans would just keep winning until there was nothing left to defend. And then Stephen happened. Suddenly, here was proof, tangible, undeniable proof, that the Ottomans could be beaten. Not through divine intervention or miraculous luck, but through strategy, preparation, and sheer determination. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. In Rome, Pope Sixtus IV declared a day of thanksgiving. He praised Stephen as a defender of Christendom and called the victory a sign of God's favor. More importantly, he used the victory as a rallying cry, urging European monarchs to support Moldavia and form a united front against Ottoman expansion. Did that actually result in coordinated military action? No. European politics was still a mess of competing interests and rivalries. But the rhetoric mattered. It shifted the conversation from, when will the Ottomans conquer everything, to, how can we support resistance movements? In Krakow, church bells rang for 3 days straight. Polish officials, who'd politely declined to help Stephen before the battle, were now scrambling to establish closer diplomatic ties. They sent congratulatory letters, offered trade agreements, and suddenly remembered all the reasons why Moldavia was an important ally. Hungary, under King Matthias Corvinus, had the most practical response. Matthias was a shrewd ruler who understood that if Moldavia fell, Hungary would be next. He sent envoys to Stephen with offers of military cooperation, shared intelligence, and even some financial support. It wasn't charity, it was self-preservation. But Stephen accepted it anyway, because Moldavia needed every advantage it could get. Across the rest of Europe, the story took on a life of its own. In taverns and marketplaces, people told and retold the tale of Vaslui. With each retelling, The details became more dramatic. Some versions had Stephen personally killing dozens of Ottoman soldiers. Others claimed divine intervention, angels appearing in the fog to guide Moldavian arrows. The truth was impressive enough, but legend always makes things better. What mattered was the effect. Stephen became a folk hero. Songs were written about him. Poems celebrated the battle. Artists painted scenes of the victory, usually with creative liberties but emotional accuracy. For the first time in decades, Europeans had a Christian military victory to celebrate. And they celebrated hard. But while Europe was throwing metaphorical parties, Stephen was dealing with the practical realities of what came next. First, rebuilding. The battle had been a victory, but it hadn't been free. Moldavia had suffered casualties, nowhere near Ottoman levels, but enough to hurt. Families had lost fathers, sons, brothers. The economy had been disrupted by months of military mobilization. Stephen established support for war widows and orphans. He ensured that veterans were compensated. He reopened trade routes and encouraged farmers to return to their fields now that the immediate threat had passed. This wasn't just compassion, it was statecraft. A nation that takes care of its people earns their loyalty. And Stephen needed that loyalty because he knew this wasn't over. Second, fortifications. Stephen used the breathing room provided by the Ottoman retreat to strengthen Moldavia's defenses. Fortresses were repaired and upgraded. New defensive positions were established along likely invasion routes. Supply depots were stocked with food, weapons, and equipment. He also continued developing his intelligence network. Spies and scouts monitored Ottoman movements along the border. Merchants traveling through Ottoman territory were quietly debriefed about what they'd seen. Every piece of information was collected, analyzed, and used to update Moldavia's defensive plans. Stephen understood something that many rulers didn't. War isn't just about winning battles. It's about preparation, intelligence, and logistics. The side that knows more and prepares better usually wins. Third, diplomacy. This was perhaps the most important and most frustrating aspect of the aftermath. Stephen needed allies. Real ones, not just symbolic support and congratulatory letters. He needed military treaties, coordinated defense plans, and shared resources. What he got was complicated. Poland was interested but cautious. They didn't want to provoke the Ottomans into attacking them directly. Hungary was more committed, but Hungary had its own problems, internal political struggles and threats from other directions. The Pope offered spiritual support and some financial aid, but no actual troops. Western European powers, France, England, Spain, were impressed by the victory, but too distant and too preoccupied with their own conflicts to get meaningfully involved. Stephen found himself in an ironic position, famous across Europe, celebrated as a hero, but still fundamentally alone when it came to the hard reality of military defense. He accepted this with the same pragmatic realism he'd shown throughout his reign. If Moldavia was going to survive, it would survive on its own terms, using its own methods. Meanwhile, in Istanbul, the Ottoman reaction was playing out exactly as Stephen had predicted. Sultan Mehmed II was furious about the defeat, but he was also a pragmatist. He understood that rushing back into Moldavia immediately would be a mistake. His generals needed time to rebuild the army. His treasury needed to recover from the financial cost of the failed campaign. And his intelligence officers needed to figure out what the hell had actually happened at Vaslui. Because from the Ottoman perspective, the loss made no sense. They'd sent an overwhelming force led by experienced commanders. They'd followed standard invasion procedures. And they'd been absolutely destroyed by an army one-third their size. How? Ottoman officials studied reports from the few survivors who'd made it back. They interviewed commanders. They tried to piece together what had gone wrong. Slowly, they began to understand terrain, weather, preparation, and brilliant tactical deception. The Moldavians hadn't won through superior numbers or equipment. They'd won through superior strategy. This was both humiliating and concerning. Because if Moldavia could do it, what about other vassal states? What about other territories thinking about resisting Ottoman rule? Mehmed knew he had to respond eventually, not just to reclaim Moldavia, but to send a message to everyone else. Resistance might win you a battle, but it won't win you the war. But that response would have to wait. For now, the empire needed to recover. Back in Moldavia, Stephen watched the border and waited. He didn't celebrate. He didn't relax. He'd bought his people time, maybe a year, maybe two. And he intended to use every day of that time to prepare for the next fight. Because one truth had become very clear at Vaslui: Moldavia could win battles against the Ottoman Empire. But could it win the war? That question would define the rest of Stephen's reign and the rest of Moldavia's history. For now, though, in the winter of 1475, there was a moment, brief, precious, where a small nation could breathe, rebuild, and believe that maybe, just maybe, it could survive. Here's a question. Why don't more people know about the Battle of Vaslui? Ask the average person to name famous medieval battles, and they'll probably say Agincourt, Hastings, maybe Thermopylae if they're feeling classical. But Vaslui, odds are you'll get a blank stare. And that's strange, because by any objective measure, Vaslui deserves to be in the same conversation. Think about the numbers: 20,000 defenders defeating 60,000 to 80,000 invaders. That's not just a victory, it's a massacre of the attacking force. The casualty ratio was devastating. The strategic impact was enormous. And the tactical execution was absolutely brilliant. So why isn't this battle more famous? Part of it is geography. Moldavia wasn't in Western Europe, where most historical narratives have traditionally been written. It was in Eastern Europe, in a region that Western historians often overlooked or simplified. Part of it is timing. The Battle of Vaslui happened in 1475, right as Europe was transitioning from the medieval period into the Renaissance. It was overshadowed by other events. The fall of Constantinople was still recent memory, the Protestant Reformation was coming, and European politics was rapidly changing. And part of it, honestly, is that Stephen's story doesn't fit neat categories. He wasn't a king of a major power. He wasn't leading a crusade. He was just a ruler of a small principality fighting for survival. But here's why that makes the story even more important. Because Stephen proved something that empires hate to acknowledge: size isn't destiny. Wealth isn't destiny. Even military superiority isn't destiny. What matters is strategy, preparation, and the intelligent use of whatever advantages you have. Let's talk about what Stephen actually accomplished. First, the immediate military impact. The Battle of Vaslui didn't just stop one invasion. It bought Moldavia years of breathing room. The Ottoman Empire did eventually return, but never with the same overwhelming confidence. They'd learned that Moldavia was dangerous, and that lesson shaped their future strategies. Second, the psychological impact on Europe. For decades after Vaslui, resistance movements across the region pointed to Stephen's victory as proof that the Ottomans could be beaten. It wasn't just inspiration. It was a practical demonstration of asymmetric warfare principles that other small states studied and adapted. Third, Stephen's own legacy. He ruled Moldavia for 47 years, an extraordinarily long reign for that era. During that time, he fought dozens of battles, won most of them, and established Moldavia as a genuine regional power despite its small size. The Romanian Orthodox Church eventually canonized him as Saint Stephen the Great. And while religious recognition isn't the same as military analysis, it reflects how deeply he impacted his people's identity and sense of survival. But let's get tactical for a moment, because that's where Stephen's genius really shows. What he did at Vaslui was essentially create a textbook example of asymmetric warfare, centuries before that term existed. Asymmetric warfare is when a smaller, weaker force uses unconventional strategies to defeat a larger, stronger opponent. It's guerrilla tactics, deception, terrain manipulation, and psychological operations. It's refusing to fight on your enemy's terms and forcing them to fight on yours. Stephen understood every element of this instinctively. He used scorched earth tactics to deny the Ottomans supplies. He used terrain to neutralize their numerical advantage. He used weather, the fog, as a weapon. He used psychological operations to make the Ottomans overconfident. He used mobility to avoid direct confrontation until he'd chosen the perfect moment to strike. Every decision was calculated to maximize Moldavian strengths and exploit Ottoman weaknesses. And here's the thing: these principles still work today. Military academies study asymmetric warfare. Special forces train on these concepts. Smaller nations facing larger threats use these strategies. Stephen was doing all of this in 1475. That's why Vaslui should be more famous. Not just as a historical curiosity, but as a genuine masterclass in military strategy. Now, it's important to acknowledge that Stephen's story doesn't have a perfect Hollywood ending. The Ottomans did come back. In 1476, Sultan Mehmed II personally led another invasion into Moldavia. This time, they were more careful, more prepared, and more determined. Stephen fought them at the Battle of Valia Alba, White Valley, and this time, he lost. It was a devastating defeat. Many historians actually consider it worse than the Ottoman loss at Vaslui. Stephen's army was crushed and Moldavia was ravaged. For a moment, it looked like everything he'd fought for was going to collapse. But here's where Stephen's character really shows. He didn't give up. He retreated, regrouped, and kept fighting. He conducted guerrilla operations. He harassed Ottoman supply lines. He made the occupation so costly and miserable that eventually, the Ottomans decided it wasn't worth it and withdrew. Moldavia survived. Barely, but it survived. And Stephen continued ruling for another 3 decades, constantly navigating threats from multiple directions, winning some fights, losing others, but always keeping Moldavia independent. That's resilience. That's the long game. So what can we learn from Stephen in the Battle of Vaslui? First, preparation matters more than size. Stephen couldn't match the Ottomans soldier for soldier, so he didn't try. He prepared the battlefield, gathered intelligence, and created conditions where his smaller force could win. Second, terrain is a weapon. Use it. The Vaslui Valley wasn't chosen randomly. It was chosen because it turned Ottoman strengths into weaknesses. Third, psychology matters. Making your enemy overconfident is sometimes as valuable as being stronger than them. Fourth, asymmetric warfare works, but only if you commit fully. Stephen didn't half-ass the scorched earth tactics or the deception. He committed completely, and that commitment made the difference. And finally, one victory isn't enough. The real challenge is sustaining resistance over time, adapting to new threats, and refusing to give up even when you lose. Stephen did all of that. Is he as famous as he should be? No. Does his story appear in most history textbooks? Sadly, no. But should it? Absolutely. Because the Battle of Vaslui is more than just a forgotten medieval skirmish. It's a demonstration of how intelligence, preparation, and strategic thinking can overcome overwhelming odds. It's a story about a small nation refusing to die quietly. And it's a reminder that history isn't just written by the big powers. Sometimes, it's shaped by the small ones who fight smart enough to survive. Stephen III of Moldavia, later Saint Stephen the Great, died in 1504, after nearly half a century of ruling a principality that everyone said was too small to survive. But it did survive, because of him. And on a frozen morning in January 1475, in a fog-covered valley near a town called Vaslui, he proved that empires aren't invincible. They're just big. And being big doesn't help when you can't see what's killing you.